My name is Diana. I'm 34 years old, and exactly 1 year ago, I was sitting in my living room on Christmas morning staring at divorce papers instead of opening presents. My husband Brandon thought I'd fall apart, beg him to stay. He even bet his friend $100 on it. But right now, as I sit in my lawyer's office watching snow fall outside, I'm the one smiling. Because the gift I gave him back wasn't tears. It was consequences. And trust me, when his lawyer called him first, he regretted every single choice he made. Before I tell you how I turned their cruelty into my victory, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button, because this story has twists you won't see coming. Now let me take you back to where it all started. Brandon and I had been married for 7 years when everything fell apart. We met at a professional conference in Chicago back when I was 27 and he was 29. He was charming, confident, successful, the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word. I was drawn to his ambition, his drive, the way he seemed to have his entire life mapped out with perfect precision. We got married in Vermont during the fall, a small ceremony with just close family and friends. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, and I remember thinking that this was the beginning of my happily ever after. We built our life in Portland, Oregon, in a 2-story house with a small garden where I planted roses every spring. I worked as a marketing manager for a mid-sized tech company, and Brandon was a financial advisor at a prestigious firm downtown. We talked about having children someday, but we weren't in a rush. We were focused on building our careers, traveling, enjoying our time together. Or at least, that's what I thought we were doing. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that started forming in September of that year. Brandon began coming home later and later, always with the same excuse about new clients who needed extra attention. At first, I believed him. Financial advisors work long hours, especially at the end of the year, when everyone's trying to sort out their portfolios before tax season. It made sense. But then the little things started adding up. In October, he stopped asking about my day. We used to sit at the dinner table and talk for hours about everything and nothing. He'd tell me about difficult clients, and I'd vent about office politics. But suddenly, those conversations dried up. He'd come home, eat dinner while scrolling through his phone, and then disappear into his home office for the rest of the evening. When I tried to engage him, his responses were short, distracted, like I was interrupting something important. Then he forgot my birthday in November. My birthday. We'd been together for 8 years, and he'd never forgotten before. When I mentioned it the next day, he looked genuinely surprised, apologized profusely, and promised to make it up to me. But he never did. There was always something more pressing, more important. The worst part was the nights when I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to find his side of the bed empty. I'd wander through the house and find him in the bathroom, phone in hand, typing furiously with this little smile on his face. When I asked who he was talking to at that hour, he'd say it was a client in a different time zone, Asia, Europe somewhere, that made the timing plausible. I wanted to believe him. I chose to believe him because the alternative was too painful to consider. By the time December rolled around, I was desperate to fix whatever was broken between us. I convinced myself that we were just going through a rough patch, the kind that every married couple experiences. I decided to make Christmas perfect, to remind him of why we fell in love in the first place. I threw myself into preparations with an almost manic energy. I spent hours decorating the house, stringing lights along the porch railing, setting up our Christmas tree in the living room corner, where it had stood every year since we moved in. I bought Brandon the Omega watch he'd been eyeing for months, the one he showed me in a magazine, and said was too expensive to justify. It cost me $2,500 money I'd been saving from my bonuses throughout the year, but I didn't care about the cost. I cared about seeing his face light up when he opened it. I made reservations at Andina, the Peruvian restaurant, where we'd had our first date in Portland. I bought ingredients to bake gingerbread cookies, a tradition we'd started our first Christmas together. I even hired someone to take down the boxes from the attic so I could wrap presents in the guest bedroom without Brandon seeing. Through all of this, there was Amber. Amber worked in my department, a junior marketing coordinator who'd transferred from our California office 2 years earlier. She was 28, energetic, always ready with a smile and a compliment. We'd become close over lunches and coffee breaks. She'd confide in me about her dating struggles, and I'd offer advice like an older sister. She seemed genuinely interested in my life too, always asking about Brandon, about our marriage, about how we made it work. I thought she was curious because she was single and wanted to understand what a good relationship looked like. I thought I was helping her, mentoring her. The irony of that makes me sick now. On December 23rd, I bought the last present, a cashmere scarf for Brandon's mother. I drove home through light snow, Christmas music playing on the radio, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Christmas was 2 days away. Everything was going to be okay. We were going to be okay. I had no idea that in 48 hours, my entire world would shatter. Christmas morning started wrong from the very first moment. I woke up at 7, excited despite everything, and reached over to find Brandon's side of the bed cold. He was already downstairs, which was unusual. Normally on Christmas, we'd wake up together, exchange sleepy good morning kisses, and go down to make coffee as a team. I pulled on my robe and headed downstairs, following the smell of coffee already brewing. Brandon was sitting at the kitchen table, still in his pajamas, staring at his phone with a frown. I tried to push down the disappointment and pasted on a bright smile. I spent the next hour making a special breakfast. Pancakes from scratch, crispy bacon, scrambled eggs with cheese the way Brandon liked them. I set the table with our good dishes, the ones we only used for holidays. I poured fresh orange juice into crystal glasses. I was trying so hard to create magic, to force happiness into existence through sheer willpower. Brandon came to the table when I called him, but it was like sitting across from a stranger. He ate mechanically, barely tasting the food I'd spent an hour preparing. He didn't compliment the meal, he didn't make jokes or try to steal bites of bacon from my plate like he usually did. He just ate in silence, his phone face down next to his plate, his eyes distant. I tried to make conversation. I talked about the snow forecast, about the dinner reservation I'd made for that evening, about how I couldn't wait to see his mother's face when she opened her present. He nodded and made non-committal sounds, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. By 10 o'clock, I couldn't take the tension anymore. I suggested we open presents. Usually we'd save it for after breakfast, drawing out the anticipation, but I needed something to break through this wall between us. I needed to see him smile to remember why we were together. We moved to the living room. The tree lights twinkled, casting warm colours across the hardwood floor. Presents were stacked beneath the branches, wrapped in red and gold paper. It should have been perfect. It should have been magical. I handed Brandon his present first, the heavy box, wrapped with care and tied with a red silk ribbon. I'd spent hours making sure the wrapping was perfect, the corners crisp, the bow symmetrical. I watched his face as he pulled off the ribbon and tore through the paper. When he opened the box and saw the Omega watch nestled in its velvet case, something flickered across his face. But it wasn't joy or surprise or gratitude. It was something else, something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe, or resignation. He lifted the watch out of the box, turned it over in his hands, examining it with the kind of detached interest you'd show to a mildly interesting object in a museum. Then he said, "Thanks." Just that. One word, flat, emotionless, empty. No hug, no kiss, no excitement about finally owning the watch he'd wanted for months. He set it back in the box and placed it on the coffee table like it was nothing more than a paperweight. I felt something crack inside my chest, but I forced myself to keep smiling. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he'd warm up as the day went on. Brandon stood up and walked to the coat closet. He returned with a white envelope, the kind you'd use for a greeting card. He held it out to me without ceremony, without the playful teasing we usually engaged in before exchanging gifts. I took the envelope with trembling fingers. Something about his expression made my stomach drop. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the contents. It wasn't a Christmas card, it wasn't a love letter or a romantic gesture or anything remotely appropriate for Christmas morning. It was divorce papers. Official legal documents with my name, typed at the top, Brandon's signature already in place at the bottom, waiting only for mine to make it complete. I stood there holding the papers, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. A cruel joke, something, anything other than what it appeared to be. My voice came out as a whisper when I finally managed to speak. What is this? Brandon sat down on the couch, his posture relaxed, almost casual, like he was discussing weekend plans, instead of dismantling our entire life together. I want a divorce, Diana. I've been thinking about this for months. The words hit me like physical blows. Months. He'd been planning this for months while I was trying to save our marriage, while I was decorating our home and buying him expensive presents and convincing myself that we were just going through a phase. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the papers. Why, what did I do wrong? He had the audacity to look almost bored by the question. It's not about you, I just don't love you anymore. Not about me, as if that made it better. As if reducing our 7-year marriage to a simple lack of feeling was somehow kinder than admitting to specific faults or failures. I looked down at the divorce papers again, forcing myself to read through the swimming text. They'd been prepared in November. While I was buying him birthday presents, he never acknowledged while I was trying to figure out what was wrong. While I was blaming myself for the distance between us, he was meeting with lawyers and filling out forms and planning to end our marriage on Christmas Day. The papers were thorough, professionally done, everything already divided with cold precision. He'd thought of everything except how to deliver this news with even a shred of human decency. I'm going out, Brandon said, standing up and grabbing his coat from the closet. I'll be back tonight to get some of my things. I found my voice stronger now, anger starting to break through the shock. Where are you going? It's Christmas. He shrugged into his coat, adjusting the collar without meeting my eyes. I have plans. Plans. On Christmas. While his wife stood in their living room holding divorce papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly too quiet house. I stood there alone, surrounded by twinkling Christmas lights and wrapped presents and the smell of gingerbread from yesterday's baking, everything that was supposed to represent joy and love and family, now just a backdrop to my complete devastation. I sank onto the couch, still clutching the divorce papers. The Omega watch sat in its box on the coffee table, already forgotten. $2,500 for a man who'd just thrown away 7 years without a second thought. I wanted to call someone. My sister Grace, my mother, a friend, anyone. But it was Christmas morning. Everyone was with their families, opening presents, laughing, enjoying the holiday. I couldn't bring myself to ruin their day with my misery. So I sat there alone in our living room as the snow began to fall outside as neighbours drove past our house on their way to family gatherings as the world celebrated around me while mine fell apart. I made it through the rest of Christmas Day in a fog. I didn't eat. I didn't move from the couch except to use the bathroom. I just sat there reading and rereading the divorce papers until the words blurred together, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. Brandon came back around 8 that evening, true to his word. He walked past me without speaking, went upstairs, and I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of his suitcase being dragged from the closet. 20 minutes later, he came down with 2 bags, still not looking at me, and left again. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that he'd just destroyed everything we'd built together. The next morning, December 26th, I finally called Grace, my younger sister, 29 years old, a high school teacher in Eugene, about 2 hours south of Portland. The moment I heard her voice, I broke down completely. Everything I'd been holding in for the past 24 hours came pouring out in gasping sobs. Grace didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'm on my way," and hung up. She arrived 2 hours later, letting herself in with her spare key. She found me still in my pajamas, still on the couch, the divorce papers scattered around me like fallen leaves. She took one look at my face and wrapped me in the kind of hug that only a sister can give, the kind that says you're not alone. I've got you, we'll get through this. After I'd cried myself out, Grace made coffee and forced me to drink it. Then she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said the words that would change everything. "This doesn't make sense. Nobody files for divorce like this without a reason. People don't just wake up and decide to end their marriage on Christmas morning." I wanted to argue to say that sometimes people fall out of love, that maybe I really wasn't enough for him. But Grace shook her head firmly. "No, there's more to this story. Have you checked his phone, his emails, his credit card statements?" The thought had never even occurred to me. In 7 years of marriage, I'd never snooped on Brandon. I trusted him completely, but Grace was right. Something about this whole situation felt calculated, planned. There had to be a reason, something I was missing. Brandon had taken his current phone and laptop, but I remembered he had an old laptop in his home office, one he'd replaced 6 months ago but never bothered to throw away. We went upstairs together and I pulled it out from the back of the closet, where it had been gathering dust. Please, I thought as I opened it, please let it be password protected. Please let there be nothing to find. Please let this just be a terrible mistake we can somehow fix. The laptop opened without requiring a password, and Brandon, in his arrogance or carelessness, hadn't bothered to delete anything. His email was still synced automatically, downloading new messages. I started reading, and the coffee I'd just drunk turned to acid in my stomach. The first few emails were innocent, work correspondence from June, back when everything still seemed normal. But then I found an email chain that made my blood run cold. The emails were between Brandon and someone named Amber. At first I thought it might be a different Amber. It had to be. Not my Amber. Not the woman I'd mentored and befriended and treated like family. But then I saw her email signature, Amber Chen, Junior Marketing Coordinator, my company, my department, my friend. The early emails from June were professional. Brandon had done some financial consulting work for my company, advising on retirement plan options for employees. Amber had been the point of contact. Nothing unusual there. But by July, the tone began to shift. "I really enjoyed our conversation over lunch today," Amber wrote. "You have such an interesting perspective on life." Brandon's response, "The pleasure was all mine. We should do it again soon." By August, they weren't even pretending anymore. "I can't stop thinking about you," Brandon wrote. "You understand me in a way Diana never has." Amber's response, "I feel the same way. This connection we have is so rare, so special." I felt bile rising in my throat. I wanted to stop reading, to close the laptop, and pretend I'd never seen any of this. But I forced myself to continue. September brought more explicit emails, discussions of hotels they'd stayed at, restaurants they'd visited, things they'd done together, all while I was at home wondering why my husband didn't love me anymore, blaming myself for whatever I'd done wrong. October was when they started planning my exit from Brandon's life. "I told Diana I don't love her anymore," Brandon wrote. "She hasn't caught on yet." Amber, "When are you going to leave her?" Brandon, "Soon. I promise. I just need to get everything in order first." November's emails were even worse. Brandon had met with a divorce lawyer, started the paperwork, planned everything out with meticulous detail. And through it all, he and Amber exchanged messages like lovesick teenagers counting down the days until they could be together openly. Then I found an email from 2 weeks ago that made me physically ill. It was a conversation between Brandon and his friend Kyle, someone I'd met a handful of times at parties. Kyle was asking about Brandon's plans for Christmas. Dude, are you really giving her divorce papers on Christmas? Kyle wrote. That's cold, Brandon's response. She's going to cry and beg. I bet you $100 she'll be a mess. Kyle, you're on. But man, that's brutal. Brandon, she'll get over it. Amber's already planning our New Year's trip to Hawaii. I stared at that email for a long time. A bet. My husband had made a bet with his friend about how I'd react to having my marriage destroyed on Christmas morning. My pain, my devastation, my complete emotional breakdown was worth $100 in entertainment value to him. Grace, reading over my shoulder, let out a string of curse words that would have made our mother faint. That piece of garbage, that absolute piece of human garbage. I should have been crying. I should have been falling apart. But instead I felt something different settling over me, something cold and hard and focused. Grace, I said, my voice steady for the first time in 2 days. I need the name of a really good divorce lawyer. My sister looked at me and a slow smile spread across her face. Now we're talking. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, Grace and I spent hours going through every email, every text message, backup, every piece of digital evidence we could find. Brandon had been careless, arrogant in his assumption that I'd never think to look. And that carelessness was going to cost him. The next morning, December 27th, I called Patricia Kowalski. Patricia was a divorce attorney I'd worked with professionally when my company had needed legal consultation on a merger. She was 45, sharp as a razor, and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. If you wanted someone who'd fight for every last dollar, every last advantage, Patricia was your woman. I left a message on her office voicemail, not expecting to hear back until after New Year's. But Patricia called me back within 2 hours. Diana, she said, her voice warm but professional, I got your message. I'm so sorry to hear about your situation. Can you come in tomorrow? Tomorrow is Sunday, I said, surprised. I know, but something tells me this can't wait. And besides, I don't have plans. Come to my office at 10. The next morning, Grace drove me to Patricia's office building in downtown Portland. We took the elevator to the 12th floor, where Patricia's firm occupied a corner suite with views of the Willamette River. Patricia met us in the reception area, dressed in jeans and a sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked more like someone's cool aunt than a legal shark, but the moment we started talking, I understood her reputation. I told her everything: the Christmas divorce papers, the emails, the affair with Amber, the bet about whether I'd cry, the money Brandon had spent from our joint account on hotels and dinners and gifts that never came home to me. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and smiled. It was not a nice smile. He made several mistakes, Diana, and we're going to use every single one of them. She pulled out a file and started explaining. Oregon was an equitable distribution state, she told me, which meant that marital property wasn't automatically split 50-50. Instead, the court looked at various factors to determine what was fair, and in cases where one spouse had committed adultery and misused marital funds, the innocent spouse could be awarded a larger share. Let's talk about your assets, Patricia said, pulling out a notepad. She walked me through everything. The house, which we'd bought for $350,000 5 years ago, was now worth about $450,000. I'd paid the down payment of $70,000 from an inheritance from my grandmother, which made it partially separate property. The remaining mortgage was about $200,000. Our joint savings account had $80,000. Brandon's 401k had about $200,000. We had 2 cars, both paid off, worth about $40,000 total. Various other assets brought our total marital estate to roughly $750,000. Under normal circumstances, we'd each walk away with about $375,000. But these weren't normal circumstances. Now let's talk about the affair, Patricia said, leaning forward. In Oregon, adultery doesn't directly affect property division, but financial misconduct does. Can you show me those credit card statements? Grace had printed everything out. We spread the statements across Patricia's conference table, and she started going through them with a highlighter. By the time she was done, nearly every page was marked. Dinner at Le Pigeon, a fancy French restaurant, $300. Hotel room at the Heathman, $450. Weekend trip to Cannon Beach, $800. Jewelry from a boutique downtown, $1,200. Spa day, $500. Transaction after transaction, date after date, all from our joint credit card and checking account. Money that should have been used for our household, our future, our shared life. Money that Brandon had spent on Amber instead. Patricia added it up. $15,000 in 6 months, all documented, all from marital funds, all spent on his mistress. In Oregon, this is called dissipation of marital assets. What does that mean? I asked. It means he has to pay it back. And it means we have grounds to argue for an unequal distribution of assets in your favor. Patricia laid out her strategy. We'd file a counter-petition to his divorce complaint. We'd attach evidence of the affair and the financial misconduct. We'd demand that I keep the house, that I receive 65% of liquid assets, and that Brandon reimburse the marital estate for the money he'd spent on Amber. We'd also request 40% of his 401k as my share of retirement assets. What about his reputation? I asked quietly. He's a financial advisor. His whole career is based on trust and ethical behavior. Patricia looked at me carefully. I'm not going to suggest we leak information to his employer or clients. That would be inappropriate and potentially illegal. But I want you to understand something, Diana. The court records will be public. If someone happened to look up your divorce case, they'd see everything we file. And if Brandon's clients happened to find out that he misused marital funds that might affect their trust in him, she wasn't saying we should tell anyone. She was just making sure I understood the natural consequences of bringing the truth to light. What do you think? Patricia asked. Are you ready to fight? I thought about Brandon's face on Christmas morning, cold and indifferent, as he handed me divorce papers. I thought about the bet he'd made with Kyle. I thought about Amber pretending to be my friend while sleeping with my husband. I thought about 7 years of my life dismissed as if they meant nothing. Yes, I said, I'm ready. Patricia smiled again, and this time it was warm, genuine. Good. Let's give them a Christmas gift they'll never forget. Patricia moved fast. On January 5th, 2 weeks after that terrible Christmas morning, she filed our counter-petition with the court. It was a thing of beauty, 30 pages of legal documentation that laid out every single way Brandon had betrayed our marriage and violated his fiduciary duty as a spouse. The petition included copies of emails between Brandon and Amber credit card statements, highlighting every expense he'd incurred for his mistress, and a detailed accounting of how he dissipated marital assets. It demanded specific performance. I would keep the house, I would receive 65% of liquid assets, and Brandon would reimburse the marital estate $15,000 for funds misappropriated during his affair. Patricia sent the petition via email to Brandon's lawyer at 9 in the morning. By 11, my phone was ringing. Brandon's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again, and again. Finally, I answered. What the hell is this? His voice was high-panicked, nothing like the calm, controlled tone he'd used on Christmas morning. You can't do this. You have no proof. I felt a surge of satisfaction, cold and sharp. Actually, Brandon, I have plenty of proof. Your emails, your credit card statements, everything. You weren't very careful, were you? Diana, please. Now he was pleading, his voice breaking. We can work this out. We don't need to do this. Can't we just settle this quietly? I thought about the bet, about him laughing with Kyle over how I'd cry and beg, about him planning a vacation to Hawaii with Amber while I was buying him Christmas presents. You should have thought about that before you bet on my tears, I said quietly. You lost that bet, Brandon, and now you're going to lose a lot more. I hung up. He called back immediately, but I blocked his number. Over the next 2 weeks, Brandon's lawyer reached out to Patricia multiple times trying to negotiate. They wanted to settle out of court, wanted to avoid the public record, wanted to make this all go away as quietly as possible. Patricia relayed every offer to me, and every time my answer was the same. No, I didn't want it swept under the rug. I didn't want to make it easy for him. He'd chosen to make a spectacle of our divorce by serving me papers on Christmas morning. Now he could live with the consequences. But there was something else I needed to do, something personal that the legal system couldn't handle for me. On January 8th, I went back to work for the first time since Christmas. I'd taken the last week off using vacation days and sick leave, telling my manager only that I was dealing with a family emergency. Now, I walked into the office with my head high, carrying my laptop bag and a small folder. Amber was at her desk typing on her computer. She looked up when I walked past, and the colour drained from her face. She'd been avoiding me, I knew. We hadn't spoken since before Christmas. I didn't stop at my own desk. I walked directly to hers. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm and clear. Amber's eyes darted around the office looking for an escape route. "Diana, I'm really busy right now. Maybe later." "Now," I said, not raising my voice, but making it clear this wasn't a request. She stood up slowly, following me to one of the small conference rooms we used for private meetings. I closed the door behind us and turned to face her. "I know everything," I said simply, "about you and Brandon. Every email, every text, every hotel room." Amber's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I don't know what you're talking about." I opened the folder I'd brought and pulled out a single page. It was a printout of an email from September where Amber told Brandon she couldn't wait to wake up next to him every morning, that she'd never felt this way about anyone before, that Diana was such a fool for not appreciating him. I placed the page on the conference room table. Amber looked at it, and what little colour remained in her face disappeared completely. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said, my voice steady, "but I want you to know something. He used our money for you. $15,000 from our joint account. Money that was supposed to be for our future. My lawyer is making sure he pays that back." Amber's hands were shaking. "I didn't know it was your money. I thought—" "You didn't care," I interrupted. "You knew he was married. You knew I worked 20 feet away from you. You sat across from me at lunch and pretended to be my friend while sleeping with my husband." Tears started streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sympathy, nothing. "But here's what you should really know about Brandon," I continued. "He bet his friend that I would cry when he gave me divorce papers on Christmas. He made a joke out of my pain, turned it into entertainment. Do you really think a man like that will treat you any better? Do you think you're special to him, or are you just convenient?" I picked up the paper and put it back in my folder. "You can have him, Amber. He's all yours. I just wanted you to understand exactly what you won." I walked out of the conference room, leaving her standing there crying. I felt nothing but a strange sense of completion, like I'd closed a door that had been hanging open. 2 days later, I heard from a coworker that Amber had called in sick. The day after that, she submitted her resignation. I never saw her again. Meanwhile, the legal battle continued. Brandon's lawyer proposed a settlement. I'd keep the house. We'd split the savings 50-50. I'd get 35% of his 401k, and he'd pay back $12,000 of the $15,000 he'd spent on Amber. Patricia brought the offer to me. "It's not bad," she said. "You'd walk away with about $600,000 in assets. That's significantly more than the 50% you'd get in a standard division." "But it's not what we asked for," I pointed out. "No, it's not. If we go to trial, we might get more or we might get less. Judges can be unpredictable. This is a sure thing." I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to fight to drag this out to make Brandon suffer as much as possible. But another part of me was just tired of thinking about him, tired of letting him take up space in my head, tired of letting this consume my life. Accept it, I told Patricia. Let's end this. On January 28th, I signed the settlement agreement. The divorce would be finalized in 30 days. Brandon signed the next day. I walked out of Patricia's office feeling lighter than I had in months. It wasn't about the money, though. The financial security was certainly welcome. It was about reclaiming my power, about refusing to be the victim he'd expected me to be, about standing up and fighting back when he thought I'd just collapse. He'd bet that I'd cry. He'd lost that bet, and now he'd lost so much more. February brought changes I hadn't expected. The first shock came when Grace called me with news she'd heard through the Portland grapevine. "Amber broke up with Brandon," she said, barely containing her glee. "What? When?" "Last week, apparently. One of my friends who works in his building saw him at a bar, drowning his sorrows. He tried to talk to her about it, said Amber told him she couldn't trust him, that if he could betray you so easily, he'd eventually do the same to her." I felt a strange mix of emotions. Not quite satisfaction, not quite vindication, but something close. Amber had finally understood what I'd tried to tell her. A man who'll betray his wife won't suddenly become trustworthy for his mistress. "There's more," Grace continued. "Apparently, some of his clients have been leaving. Word got around about the divorce, and you know how it is in professional circles. People talk." I hadn't said anything to anyone about Brandon's behaviour. I hadn't posted on social media, hadn't gossiped to mutual friends, hadn't tried to damage his reputation. But the court records were public, and Portland's professional community was smaller than people realised. Someone had looked up the case, someone had read the filings, and someone had talked. I should have felt guilty about that. Patricia had warned me it might happen, that bringing everything into the light could have consequences beyond the courtroom. But I didn't feel guilty. I felt nothing. Brandon's reputation was suffering because of his own actions, not because of anything I'd done. At work, things were slowly returning to normal. With Amber gone, there was no awkward tension, no wondering when I'd run into her in the break room. My co-workers knew I was going through a divorce, though I'd kept the details private. They were respectful, giving me space when I needed it and support when I asked for it. One afternoon in late February, I was working late when my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. "Diana," a male voice said when I answered. "This is Kyle, Brandon's friend. Can we talk?" I almost hung up, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want, Kyle?" "I want to apologize. Can I buy you a coffee?" That was the last thing I expected, but I agreed partly because I wanted to hear what he had to say, and partly because I was genuinely curious about what would drive him to reach out. We met at a Starbucks near my office the next day. Kyle looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his cup, not quite meeting my eyes. "I knew about the bet," he said finally. "The one about whether you'd cry. I should have told you. It was wrong, and I'm sorry." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. He sighed. "Because Brandon's been calling me complaining about how you ruined him, how you took everything, how you destroyed his relationship with Amber, how you damaged his reputation. But I saw the settlement. I know what actually happened. You didn't ruin him, Diana. You just didn't let him ruin you." He looked up at me then, and I saw genuine regret in his eyes. I realized I was part of something really cruel. I participated in it, even encouraged it. I made a bet on your pain like it was a football game. That says something terrible about the kind of person I am, and I needed to apologize face to face. I appreciated the apology more than I expected to. It didn't change anything, didn't undo the hurt, but it acknowledged it. It said that what happened to me mattered, that it was wrong, that I deserved better. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, "but I don't need your apology to move on. I've already moved on." And I had. Not completely, not perfectly, but I was getting there. March 15th arrived the day the divorce would be finalized. I took the morning off work and drove to the courthouse. Brandon was already there with his lawyer when I arrived, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom. He looked thinner, older somehow, as if the past 3 months had aged him 5 years. Our lawyers did most of the talking with the judge. It was a brief hearing, just a formality, really. The settlement had already been approved. This was just making it official. When the judge signed the papers, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. 7 years of marriage ended with a signature and a stamp. I walked out of the courtroom into the bright March sunlight. Brandon followed me outside, calling my name. "Diana, wait!" I stopped and turned around. He looked at me with something I might have called desperation a few months ago. Now I just saw it as pathetic. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything. For how I treated you, for how I ended things, for all of it. I was stupid." I looked at him for a long moment. Once I'd loved this man with everything I had. Once I'd thought we'd grow old together, raise children together, build a whole life together. Once his opinion had mattered more to me than my own. Now I just felt indifferent. "You were," I agreed. "But that's not my problem anymore. Goodbye, Brandon." I walked to my car and drove away without looking back. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated or even particularly relieved. I just felt free. 6 months after that terrible Christmas morning, I stood in my living room looking at the changes I'd made. The walls were a different colour now, a warm sage green instead of the beige Brandon had insisted on. The furniture had been rearranged, some pieces sold new ones, bought to fit my taste instead of compromise. The house felt different, lighter somehow, like it could finally breathe. Grace visited often, usually bringing wine and takeout. We'd sit on my new couch, the one I'd picked out myself, without having to consider anyone else's opinion, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes we talked about Brandon and what had happened. More often we didn't. He was becoming a smaller and smaller part of my life, relegated to the past, where he belonged. I'd joined a book club through the local library, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was trying to save my marriage. I met people who knew me as Diana, the marketing manager, Diana, the reader, Diana, the person, not Diana, the wife, or Diana, the divorcee. It was refreshing to build relationships with people who had no connection to my past. I wasn't dating yet. People kept asking if I was ready to get back out there, as if finding a new relationship was the goal, the finish line I needed to cross to prove I'd recovered. But I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in learning how to be alone without being lonely, how to enjoy my own company, how to build a life that was complete on its own without needing someone else to validate it. I'd started therapy too, working through not just the betrayal and divorce, but the patterns that had led me to ignore red flags, to blame myself for someone else's cruelty, to try so hard to fix something that was broken from the start. It was hard work, uncomfortable work, but necessary. One evening in September, almost exactly a year after Brandon started his affair, I was sitting on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over the garden I'd completely redesigned. My roses were blooming deep red and pristine white, and I'd added herbs and vegetables I actually wanted to grow instead of the ornamentals Brandon had preferred. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "How are you doing?" I thought about how to answer. A year ago, I'd been lost broken, convinced that I wasn't enough. I'd internalized Brandon's rejection, made it mean something about my worth as a person. Now I knew better. His betrayal wasn't a reflection of me. It was a reflection of him, of his choices, of his character. I hadn't failed at marriage. He had failed at being a decent human being. I typed back, "I'm doing really well," and I meant it. I learned something important through all of this, something I want to share with anyone who's ever been made to feel small, worthless, or broken by someone who claimed to love them. Strength isn't about never breaking down. It's not about holding everything together with white knuckles and gritted teeth, pretending you're fine when you're falling apart inside. Real strength is in the choice you make after you've been knocked down. "Do you stay down or do you get back up?" I cried after Brandon left. I cried a lot, actually. I had moments where I couldn't get out of bed, couldn't imagine ever feeling whole again, Couldn't see a future that didn't include the person I thought I'd spend my life with. Those tears weren't weakness. They were grief, and grief is human. But grief isn't where I stayed. I didn't let Brandon's cruelty define the rest of my story. I didn't accept his narrative that I was someone worth discarding, someone whose pain was entertaining someone who existed only to make his transition to a new life more convenient. Brandon bet on my weakness. He thought he knew me well enough to predict how I'd react. Thought 7 years of marriage gave him insight into my breaking point. He expected tears, and begging expected me to crumble so completely that I'd just sign whatever papers he put in front of me and let him walk away with everything he wanted. He was wrong. Not because I'm superhuman or because I didn't feel pain, but because somewhere beneath the grief and shock, I found something I didn't know I had. Not anger, though. There was plenty of that. Not revenge, though. I won't pretend the justice of it all didn't feel good. What I found was a fundamental understanding of my own worth. A realization that I deserved better than what he was offering, and a refusal to let him write the ending to my story. The money helped, I won't lie about that. Financial security matters, especially when you're starting over. But that's not what made me whole again. What healed me was realizing that I could fight for myself, advocate for myself, stand up and say, no, this isn't acceptable, I deserve better, and I'm going to make sure I get it. Amber reached out once about 4 months after everything ended. A long email full of apologies and explanations and justifications. She claimed she hadn't known how serious my marriage was, that Brandon had told her we were basically already separated, that she'd never meant to hurt me. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I realized I didn't need her apology. Whether she felt guilty or not, whether she'd meant to hurt me or not, it didn't change what had happened. And it didn't change the fact that I'd moved on. Brandon, I heard through the grapevine, moved to Seattle about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. A fresh start, presumably somewhere his reputation hadn't preceded him. I hope he learned something from what happened. I hope he became a better person, but honestly, I don't think about it much. His growth or lack thereof isn't my responsibility or my concern. What I think about instead is how I almost let his betrayal destroy me, how close I came to believing that his inability to value me meant I had no value, how I could have signed those papers on Christmas Day, accepted his terms, and spent the rest of my life wondering what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been enough, how I could have saved a marriage that was already dead. That version of my story ends very differently. In that version, I'm smaller, quieter, less whole. In that version, he wins. But that's not the version that happened. In the real version, I stood up. I fought back. I refused to be the victim he tried to make me. And in doing that, I discovered I'm stronger than I ever knew. So here's what I want you to understand, what I wish someone had told me on that terrible Christmas morning when I sat alone in my living room holding divorce papers with shaking hands. When someone bets against you, when they assume your weakness, when they treat your pain as a joke or your life as an inconvenience, you have a choice. You can fulfill their expectations, collapse into the role they've written for you, or you can rewrite the script entirely. I chose to rewrite it. I gave Brandon and Amber a gift they'll regret for the rest of their lives. Not the gift of my tears or my brokenness, but the gift of consequences. I showed them that actions have results, that betrayal has a price, that you can't treat people as disposable without it coming back to you. But more importantly, I gave myself a gift. The gift of self-respect, the gift of knowing that I'm worth fighting for, even if I have to be the one doing the fighting, the gift of understanding that my worth isn't determined by who does or doesn't choose to love me, but by how I choose to love and value myself. That's the real story here. Not revenge, though. There was some satisfaction in watching karma work itself out. Not even justice, though. The legal victory certainly helped. The real story is about a woman who thought her life was ending on Christmas morning and discovered instead that it was just beginning. I'm not going to tell you I'm glad it happened. I'd never choose to go through that pain again. But I will tell you, I'm glad I went through it the way I did, standing up instead of lying down, fighting instead of surrendering, choosing myself instead of accepting someone else's judgment of my worth. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you, where someone bet against you, thought you'd break, thought you'd give up? What did you do? Drop your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you fought back or how you're planning to. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because I share these stories to remind all of us that we're stronger than we think, that we deserve better than we sometimes accept, and that standing up for ourselves is never the wrong choice. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's going through something hard and needs to know they're not alone. Share it with someone who's forgotten their own strength and needs a reminder. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here, for caring, for taking the time to understand that behind every story of betrayal and divorce and heartbreak is a real person trying to find their way back to themselves. I hope wherever you are right now, whatever you're going through, you remember this: you're worth fighting for. Your pain isn't entertainment. Your tears aren't a joke. And when someone bets against you, you don't have to prove them right. Stand up, fight back. Show them what you're really made of, because trust me, that's a gift they'll never forget. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember that your worth isn't determined by who stays or leaves, but by how you choose to stand up for yourself when it matters most. Until next time.